Good morning. Welcome. It's early here. It's a little before 8 a.m. in New York City, but it's the perfect time to talk about viticulture. This is a really fun class to work with and prepare for, and I think you could really spend your whole life with the study of viticulture and always learn something new. But today I think we'll really try to give you a foundation, a basis for understanding how viticulture is especially linked to wine quality and how many opportunities that these growers really have to kind of manipulate the vineyard based on the climate, the style of wine that they want to produce, and how many options there are available. I think we might not always see different types of vineyards, especially if you travel to one wine growing region. The vineyard might be fairly uniform in those regions because it's what really worked for the climate and the grape varieties that are specifically grown there. So we'll take a look at how many options there are and why you might employ these different options based on grape variety, climate, and style of wine that you're looking to produce. So I really think we should just dive right in. Most of you might know me. I don't know. I should introduce myself. I'm Amber. I'm the Assistant Beverage Director at Corkbuzz. And we're talking about viticulture today. So just set up the screen to share here. And we will, of course, send out a follow-up with these slides. There's a lot of wonderful, dense information. We won't be able to dissect all of it. So you will get a follow-up with both an outline of the class, this recording, and these slides in a PDF form as well, so that you can reference them later on your own. Such fun stuff. Okay. I just need my pop-down box to go away here so that I can so I can make my slideshow bigger. Sorry, always a lot of fun when it comes to working with live recordings and Zoom, right? I say this all the time. We've been doing this for years now, and yet every time I get in front of the screen with Zoom recording, I'm always like, wait, where is this button? How do I share this slideshow? So anyway, we've made it. We're there. Much how I imagine a lot of growers feel during the different growing seasons of the year, and how the grapes are responding to the climatic differences from year to year. So here we're located in California. We're looking over the Mathiasen Vineyard in Oak Knoll. It's located on the western side. Steve Mathiasen is a viticulturalist. You might be familiar with his wines that he does make with his wife, Jill, but really traditionally, Steve had worked for some of the biggest names that you might see in Napa Valley before managing his own vineyard and starting his own wine brand as well. But Steve really is the driving force in very healthy vineyard life, viticulture within Napa Valley, really well regarded. So what we're talking about today is a year in the vineyard, what we can expect. We'll talk about the climate, terroir, and the grapevine or grapevines, I guess we should say, vine training and pruning, the choices that go into selecting how you're going to train your vine and then prune it. Vine diseases and insect threats we'll go over as well. And then we'll talk at the end about some of the more sustainable models of viticulture that are popular, predominantly biodynamic and organic farming. This is a photo taken in the Eola Amity Hills in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. This is in the Hopewell Vineyard that was until recently owned and worked by Mimi Castile and her group of workers, her employees. Mimi Castile is a really important figure in what we call regenerative agriculture that we will be talking about in a bit as well. But you can just see from the photo here, this is not a glamour shot vineyard from this photo, right? And oftentimes these more sustainable models of vineyard work, organic biodynamics, regenerative farming, they're not the prettiest. They're a little bit more on the wild and more feral side. When you look at these, they're not the kind of glossy, sometimes, Napa Valley or big giant Australia vineyard that you might see. We're really letting the biodiversity of the land come through with different cover crops, weeds that are growing, and how we actually train the vine or the canopy here as well. So what is viticulture? So viticulture is everything that happens in the vineyard. It's all of the decisions that you make around creating, crafting, planting, and maintaining your vineyard. Viticulture really is related to how we maintain a vineyard for quality grape growing and quality wine. Vitis vinifera is the main grape variety that we'll discuss today. We might get into some hybrids or crossings a little bit later on when we talk about clones. But Vitis vinifera, the European grapevine, is first domesticated nearly 5,000 years before the Common Era. It was heavily prized in the ancient world because it is a style of fruit that obtains high sugar levels. And this can be really great for both fermentation, but also it's an important nutrition aspect in the ancient world. Today, there are more than 10,000 Vitis vinifera grape varieties, but about 1,400 of them we actually cultivate for commercial use. So a lot of grapevines out there. If you've taken my classes before, one of the biggest things I always say is drink more than just the top 5, right? Or the top 10. Like, look for those grape varieties that are lesser known, are more indigenous to specific areas. This would be like Eastern European, Greek grapevines, a lot of Italian grapes that you might not come across every day, because this allows them to continue to be commercially relevant. If we don't buy these other styles of wine and grapes, they won't be commercially relevant and we'll lose them. And we'll be left with, just, I'm not saying this as a way to knock Cabernet, Chardonnay, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, of course, but it's really amazing to have these other grape varieties in the world that are available to us. So viticulture is the study of grape growing. It develops slowly, really in conjunction with the cultivation of the vine. Growers oftentimes learn from instinct and observation, especially in relation to specific grape varieties that were matched to specific terroir, and how to work those grape varieties in the vineyard and then make the resulting wine. Right? So we always think of, I think, like the appellation system as related to place, right? And viticulture is an important aspect of that, the appellation system, regarding where and how you can grow your grapes and treat your vines within specific regions, right? We also make decisions during the year on vine training, the methods that we use to prune. So training, and we might repeat this in a little bit. So essentially, we're going to talk later on about training, trellising, and pruning. Trellising can also be seen as canopy management, which you have here. So you make these decisions on vine training. Vine training is how you're actually going to train and keep the hard parts of the vine. So primarily the trunk and the cordons. If you're utilizing cordons in your vineyard on your vine, how you're going to prune said vines, canopy management, or trellising. This is how you manage the shoots, the leaves, the grapes, the vegetative growth during the growing season. Are we fertilizing? Are you irrigating if it's allowed? There's a lot of wine growing regions where irrigation is not allowed, but a lot of New World regions are established on the basis of irrigation. When are you going to harvest your grapes? This changes every single year based on the climatic conditions of the season. We'll get a little bit more into that, but this is one of the, I would imagine, one of the most difficult aspects of being a viticulturalist or even a winemaker, because oftentimes a winemaker will actually dictate the pick date in a vineyard based on the style of wine that they're trying to achieve, right? And sometimes that's not always congruent. It's not always in line. The style of wine that you want to produce is not always, it's not always lined up with when you actually have to harvest, if there's impending or inclement weather that's going to be coming in. Disease control, this goes back, we'll talk later, organic, biodynamic, regenerative farming, how we care for the land, and how we establish these vineyards for the future. Vineyards are a very interesting crop, right? Because you have a single harvest every year. And also they're established, they can be established for a very long time. And if you need to replant vines or your entire vineyard, it takes quite some time for those vines to be established and then become commercially viable. It is intensely expensive to replant or regraft, and we typically don't grow, I mean, really never, you know, in vineyards, we don't grow vines from seeds. Every seed is different. And so grapevines that are grown from seed may not necessarily have the same attributes as the parent vine. So we usually always either graft or clone grapevines or select positive traits from Masal selection, which this is all coming up, right? So the first thing that we're going to talk about is a year in the vineyard. I met a girl, in 2014, I worked harvest in Germany. I was there for about 2 months. But I met a girl that was working for Lights Wines in the Rheingau from San Francisco, and she was there for the full year. She wanted to work in a vineyard for the full year and see how it was, or see the process, not how it was, but I guess more of the process. And, you know, the process is very interesting because you repeat the same thing often for a few weeks or a few months at a time. A lot of it is just managing and watching the vines, and seeing how they're doing, if there's going to be any issues with disease, pest, ripening, etc. Right? So how do we look through a year of the grapevine? And we'll go through this quickly because, like I said, we could just spend hours and hours, but I won't do that to you. So we discuss the embryo bunches first will bloom into small flowers. So this is when you see these teeny tiny little flowers and clusters that begin to burst open onto the vine. Grapevines, we've selected grapevines that are more or less self-pollinating. They're not all, you do have some grapevines that are, you can have male or female grapevines in the vineyard, but then you also have hermaphroditic vines. This is typically what we choose for the production of grapes. The self-pollinating vine begins the process of fertilization, and this fertilization will lead to fruit set of these flowers. During this time, especially at the beginning of the cycle of the vine, and then the end, with the end of the cycle of the 100 days, we'll get into this, would be harvest, right? The vine and either the flowers or the grapes that are being set and fertilized, or at the end, your healthy ripe grapes, are really susceptible to especially frost, very susceptible to wind, very susceptible to cold. And especially in the springtime, you know, when grapes burst and begin to flower for the first time, you still have a lot of weather that can go one way or the other. So meaning, especially in a lot of European regions, you see frost during the spring and frost during the harvest, which can be a really big issue. And this really limits your yields, because these flowers or these small berries are so delicate that when you have frost, it really could damage them. And then they won't set and ripen into healthy grape clusters. I hope I'm explaining this well. I did want to say at the beginning also is, you know, if I misspeak on something, I apologize. There's a lot of information here, and that sometimes that does happen when you were just going through these slides. So I hope I explained these things well for you. So these pollinated embryos lead to grape clusters. Each grape is the product of individual fertilization. So this is why you usually see around 30% of the actual berries or the fruit set to become healthy grapes that we use for wine production. So the remaining berries will shatter. We call this like couleur. And you can see this on grapevines where you have some berries, but then still some flowers that are falling off, right? Or you might see a grape bunch that has unripened grapes that didn't really set. as well as some ripened grapes on the same grapevine. And this is because some of those flowers just didn't set into berries. So, and again, a lot of the issues with this can be due to the climatic conditions in the springtime during flowering. The berries the remaining ones begin to enlarge, but they are hard for quite a bit of time. They're very green, they're hard to touch, they're intensely high in acidity. If you were to pick one off the vine, it would be really tough to chew and really, really tart. The skin would be thick. They're very low in sugar at this time. We move into essentially like a millerandage can happen between the berries enlarging and the veraison, which is where some of the grape flowers are failing to fertilize. This reduces yield, creates uneven ripeness. Actually, we kind of have this in the wrong spot because that's what I just mentioned. And then also the vine can mature at different rates. It's important to understand that sometimes millerandage can be seen as beneficial to certain styles of winemaking or grape varieties. There are certain clones of Chardonnay that are prone to millerandage just on their own. Another example would be the Zinfandel grape, which just as a grape variety is prone to millerandage, meaning that when you pick Zinfandel grapes, you oftentimes on one bunch almost have like kind of what you're beginning to see here, right? Where it's like you have these raisinated grapes that are overripe, you have perfectly ripe grapes, and you might have some underripe grape. But this is what is responsible for that giant kaleidoscope of fruit that you get in a glass of Zinfandel that can be really beautiful. And it's also what allows Zinfandel to have these gorgeous, like almost like fig and raisin flavors, but we're still bright acidity. And obviously now producers can make the choice in the vineyard. They might leave those Zinfandel grapes to get really ripe, and you'll have more jammy, more figgy flavors, and more moderate acidity, not as high as if you picked the grapes a little bit earlier. So we move into veraison. This is when the grapes truly begin to ripen. The sugars start to move from the leaf system to the fruit. So we'll get into it, but photosynthesis is one of the most important aspects of what a grapevine does through its leaves. We have to have the leaves and the canopy in order to ripen these grapes. The leaves are what absorb sunlight, create photosynthesis, create sugars that ripen the grape. The grape begin to soften. You can see this physical change in the vineyard as you're walking through it. At the beginning, all grapes are green, right? They're all green, they're all hard, they're all acidic, they're all low in sugar. As veraison begins to happen, the skin starts to soften and change its color as well. So you see your red grape go from hard green grapes to colored skins, right? So kind of red or black, purple, depending on what grape variety you have. And you see your white grape moving from this really like tart, hard green color into more of your kind of like softer yellow, sometimes a little pink golden color that you see on different grapevines like Pinot Gris, Riesling, Chardonnay, Gewürztraminer, etc. And there's some grape varieties that there's such a gorgeous color. Gewürztraminer, I think, is a really great example of that, where it's this like deep pink color. Sometimes with Pinot Gris, it's almost like a dusty purple to the skin. And it's just really a lot of different colors that you see in the skins of the grapes here. After veraison, we begin to see cane ripening. This happens with the stems and shoots. They begin to lignify. This is when the stems and the shoots kind of begin to turn a little bit more woody and harder. And then once the grape has achieved the optimum amount of sugar and retained the right amount of acidity for the style of wine wanting to be made, they're ready for harvest. In a perfect world, all grapes would be harvested at the perfect level of ripeness when you still have enough acidity to keep the wine fresh and bright. But in the real world, because grapes are grown outside in weather, this doesn't always happen. And this is why we really look at the vintage conditions when we think about a bottle of wine, because a lot of times, especially in more marginal climates like, like in France, in Bordeaux, in Northern Italy, we really have to think about getting the grapes into the winery before inclement weather can hurt them. If you have, things like frost in the fall season that can damage the grapes, a really big issue during harvest is rain, which we'll move into a little bit later, but rain will swell your grapes, and it can allow them to burst on the vine, which will invite a lot of disease or fungal rot into the grape that will produce really off flavors. But even if it were to rain, like typically we never pick grapes when it's raining because the grapes have swollen, and that will actually dilute the flavor that you have and the concentration of flavor that you have in the grape. So you would rarely ever pick them during the rain. So producers sometimes have to make that choice. I want a few more days to ripen my grapes. They're not quite ready, but rain is coming and I don't know when it's going to stop. So your producer might end up picking their grapes on a side of ripeness that is not necessarily what they intended for. So every year the producer has to change how they make their wine in a way to respond to these vintage conditions. And another important concept of the harvest too is, do you have people to pick your grapes? When I worked harvest in Oregon, you hire pick teams and they're so busy during the harvest season. It's like, you might just have to hire your pick team for the day that you can get them, and maybe not necessarily the day that you want to pick your grapes for your optimal ripeness. So you're constantly changing your approach. At least the best producers are constantly changing their approach to how they're going to make their wine based on the growing season and then the harvest. So we'll talk about the climate, the terroir, the grapevine. Vines really need an annual temperature between 50 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit with an ideal of 57 degrees. We really don't want it to be too hot. When it is too hot in a wine growing region, the grapevine itself actually shuts down. So it closes what's called its stome, which is kind of how a grapevine breathes, and it stops expiring carbon dioxide, and the grapevine actually stops ripening. So if you have a really, really hot summer, you might actually have a resulting wine from that vintage that has sort of like green and herbaceous flavor in it, because in order to preserve the plant, the vines shut down its ripening in order to protect its reserves and its stores of water. Red grapes need warmer temperatures. We're ripening the skin to use in the production of the wine, so approximately 70 degrees. White grapes need an average temperature of 66 degrees to ripen. All of these numbers are in Fahrenheit today. And we grow most grapes in a band of latitude between 30 and 50 degrees in both the northern and the southern hemisphere. And if you were to look at a map of that, I mean, the northern hemisphere latitude band run through, North America, right? All of your main wine growing regions, every 50 state does produce wine. So North America, and then all of Europe, even places like China. And then the southern hemisphere band of latitude is your wine growing countries like the southern tip of South Africa, southern Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, etc. We oftentimes use something called the heat summation index, or the Winkler index, to decide how we're going to plant grapevines. So every grapevine has its own personality. And we'll get into that, especially with trellising systems and pruning. So they really have a preferred temperature and climate that they like to grow in. Pinot Noir and Cabernet do not like the same climate. So even in places like Napa Valley, they'll oftentimes be planted in different altitudes to mitigate the climate a little bit with altitude, right? So the heat summation index, we take the growing season, which is usually right around 100 days, more or less between April 1st and October 31st. And the number of degrees is equal to the average daily temperature minus 50. That's kind of weird the way it looks. But essentially, during this 100 days of the growing season in each region, every day that is higher than 50 degrees, you take and you minus 50 from, right? And then during that 100 days growing season, you take your number for every single day and you add it together. So that's what gives us the to 2,500 degree day, 2,500 to 3,000 degree days, and so forth. And then you use this summation index to help you decide which grapevine will do best in your climate. So region 1 is the coolest. We have, recommendations for things like Pinot Noir, Gewürztraminer, Chardonnay would be great examples. I would say that something like Riesling would be in this category as well. Region 2, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc. They like warmer temperatures. You have grapes with thicker skin that need more consistent ripening, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot. Region 3, grapes that really like a little bit more sun. Now, this one is kind of surprising to me, and I need to do a little more research about Gamay preferring this, because even though it's planted in the southern part of Burgundy, it's definitely moving into a slightly more Mediterranean climate than the rest of Burgundy, which is very continental. I was surprised to see Gamay in region 3, but we do see it planted in places like the Sierra Foothill in California as well, which really can be quite warm, but there is a lot of elevation in the Sierra Foothill also. Zinfandel, we know it's a sun worshipper. It loves to ripen. And then when we start to get into region 4 and region 5, usually these are for grapes that are really can mitigate issues of drought, have traditionally been grown in really warm or coastal regions. Malvasia is a great example of that, and also mostly table grapes. So the wonderful thing about grapevines, right? More than 50% of what we grow for vines is used for wine production, but it's used for so many other things, and not just Vitis vinifera, other styles of grapes, right? So we have jams, we have jellies, we have table grapes, we have Manischewitz. I guess you would keep that in the wine category, but anyways, a little bit of humor. So moving on, still climate terroir in the grapevine. So we need approximately a minimum of 1,300 hours of sunshine during the growing season to ripen grapes. We need about 10 to 30 inches of rain annually. If you have less than 10 inches of rain, you really need to irrigate your grapevines, especially when they're being established. You don't really want to, we don't have a lot of discussions about irrigation in this class today, but it's an important topic, right? Because I think one of the funnest things about doing a class like this is giving the consumer an opportunity to think critically about what is marketed toward them in terms of considering quality grape growing and winemaking. And what I mean by that is, I often see producers who have head trained vines, which we'll talk about, these are dry farmed, head trained. And we really have to think about all of these different techniques within the context of the region that they're in, right? And so what I mean by that, talking about irrigation, is, Washington, California can produce immensely high quality wine, but there are some regions that you just have to irrigate, and you especially have to irrigate the vine when it's young and it's establishing its root system. But then you really have to be careful about over irrigating, because over irrigating a grapevine, irrigating it will help establish the root system when it's young, but over irrigating the grapevine will actually cause the root system to grow closer to the surface rather than growing down and seeking out more water and nutrients from deeper in the soil, right? You have a lot of surface roots when you water too much from the top. So that's why you see, especially in a lot of high quality grape growing regions that do irrigate, you see systems of drip irrigation, where genuinely every vine can be controlled with how much water it gets. You're just watering it just enough to keep it healthy but also still allow the root to grow down. Usually they like to say that grapevines that are not irrigated tend to be more stable for longer. They might have a longer lifespan, and they're also more drought resistant because they really are building those vines down to look for the water table. We also think about things like wind. Wind can harm the grapes when it's too heavy, too hard, but it also helps to mitigate a lot of humidity and fungal issues in a lot of wine growing regions. So a lot of, especially European regions, and even places in the New World, Willamette Valley we mentioned is a really great example with the Van Duzer corridor. These winds really come in and keep what would otherwise be areas that might be too humid for quality grape growing much drier. And when you have a drier region, you have less issues with fungal disease, rot, etc. You might need less treatment for your vine to combat the rot and the fungal disease. Going back to the idea of rainfall, when you think about a couple of examples, Washington State, some of the wine growing regions really are considered desert. They receive less than 6 inches of not just rainfall, precipitation in a year, and a lot of that is snow in the winter. But somewhere like Chablis or a lot of places in somewhere like France might get like 22 inches or so annually, right? So we talk about the concept of terroir. So what is terroir? It's a French concept. We always break it down, right? Terroir is the taste of place. That's the kind of simplified version of what terroir is, but it is a complete system of factors that influence the vine based on where it is grown. And the concept of terroir means that because it is an agricultural product, grown, especially for a grapevine that has an established root system, grown in a specific place, that specific style of wine really cannot be replicated anywhere else. So we also have kind of 3 types of major climates that we look at in terms of how the grape vineyard or the grapevine is managed. So we have the macro climate, which is the regional climate of an area or a region. The Rheingau is essentially a south-facing slope, right? But you do have different aspects. The top of the slope up near the forest, near the Taunus Mountain, and then you also have the lower parts of the slope that are closer to the Rhine River. Medoc has a fairly uniform maritime climate. There's not a lot of elevation change in Medoc, but then somewhere like Napa, you have valley fruit, and you have mountain fruit, right? And there are a lot of peaks and valleys. And this is one of the reasons that Napa is divided into these 16 sub-AVAs, right? And they're named for usually the towns or the mountains that they're near, but they really do believe that there is a pretty stark climatic difference in the different AVAs that affect the grape. You can put that in your bottle on your label to give a producer a snapshot of what they should be able to expect. The mesoclimate is the climate of your vineyard, not the regional climate. So this is where your slope, your aspect, your altitude is. This is really where we begin to look at the concept of terroir, especially in places like Burgundy, where they say, well, we're planting Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but based on where they're planted on the slope, it can be different. And so that's why in some places, and Burgundy is the perfect example, we have begun to name these individual vineyards or plots of land, and we make single styles of wine from them. So the mesoclimate of a single vineyard, Corton, of course, though, is much larger. So there's going to be more mesoclimates in Corton than a more uniform vineyard like La Tâche. The microclimate is the climate of the vine, and this includes how we manage our canopy, how we prune during the winter, how we remove leaves as we approach the harvest season. Why would we remove leaves? Usually in cooler regions, it's to help assist with airflow, usually in maybe a wet year. You don't want to remove leaves too early, because if it gets dry and warm, you expose your grape to sunburn. So leaf removal will usually be done close to the harvest when you want to make sure that you have healthy grapes that aren't beginning to rot. This includes shoot positioning and the trellising systems. We mentioned earlier, training is due to the woody parts of the vine. The trellising system is how we manage the actual canopy, right? The shoots, the leaves, the canes, and the grapes. Soils. So we say that the vine should always struggle. Vines prefer soil that don't grow a lot of other agricultural crops. They do like soils that are a little bit more nutrient sparse. They like well-drained soils that are penetrable, but still have good water retention without staying wet and soggy. This really permits the roots of the vine to dig deep for water and minerals. This is what we discussed before. Penetrable soils allows those roots to really grow. And if you go somewhere like, I mean, pre-rot is a great example where you have this schist soil that is friable and fractured, and these root systems will just find all these little crevices within the soil and grow there. It's a really, really unique way of growing grapes in places like pre-rot. So we think a lot about these different soil types. How do they retain and reflect heat? This is important in correlation with both the grape variety that you're planting and also within the climate. Soil pH is very important in wine on the pH scale 0 to 14. Usually we say that the grapevines planted in soils that are usually between 3 and, I'm forgetting the other number, 3 and 9, I think is the number for soil pH for grapevine. Higher pH will usually, higher acidity is attributed to lower pH in soils, these really alkaline, oftentimes chalky styles of soil, especially things like limestone. Low pH soils are typically inhospitable to agriculture, as well as high pH, but really high pH. But viticulture really does thrive in these soils. This low pH can be a deterrent to viticulture, but it can be countered by the application of lime. We also have different nutrients within the soil that are really necessary for the growth of healthy grapes and also the production of wine coming from those grapes. Nitrogen, you absolutely have to have in your soil. This helps with the growth of the vine, but also really importantly, you need this nitrogen in the grapes when they come into the winery, because nitrogen really assists in the fermentation of the wine. When you don't have enough nitrogen, you might run into a lot of issues with stuck fermentation, where the juice itself just stops fermenting and you're left with a higher sugar, lower alcohol juice than you might want for your wine. Potassium is really important in the soil that helps with a lot of the water uptake of the vine. It allows the root to really be able to uptake water and move them into the grapes and the leaves for ripening. Magnesium helps for photosynthesis. It's something you really need in the soils for the leaves. Calcium helps preserve and strengthen. Actually, funny, right? Calcium, preserve and strengthen, just like for our bones. But it really helps preserve and strengthen the skins of the grapes. So this can protect against inclement weather issues, right? Can help protect against rain, hail, frost, things like that. Is it 100% protection? Of course not, but it just does strengthen the skins of those grapes a little bit. And then you have cation exchange. Sorry, I'm forgetting the third word for CEC, but it is essentially the way that the different porosity and styles of soil are positively and negatively charged, and also help with the absorption of the different nutrients that you might see within the soil. You can have too much of all of these nutrients, which will also be detrimental to the grapevine. So it's really about finding soils that have the correct level of these different nutrients based on what you really need for your region or for your winery once you get your grapes inside the winery to make your wine. Why do we need magnesium to help with chlorophyll absorption? Because that's how we ripen our grapes, right? If you don't have enough magnesium, the leaves will start to yellow. Sometimes you see this in a vineyard during the growing season. When the leaves yellow, they're not absorbing enough sunlight. They're not creating enough photosynthesis, which is how we actually ripen our grapes. It is the leaves reaching out to the sun, absorbing and photosynthesizing that sunlight that ripens the actual grapes on the vine. All right, moving on. Let's talk about clones. So clones are selected for very specific reasons. So that could be resistant to specific types of disease. That could be hardiness for the weather. That could be to make higher or lower yields. We like to say that in winemaking, lower yields are preferred because the lower yields do tend to have more complex grape flavors, more concentration of flavors, more concentrations of aromatics. But what does a grower like? Growers like high yield because most growers are paid by how many grapes they grow on their vines, right? So this is why a lot of, if a producer does not own their own vineyard and work the vineyard, or a winemaker doesn't own and work the vineyard themselves, they usually have contracts with these growers to help tell them how they want their grapes grown in order for them to buy them. So, you know, they go into a contract. This is the style of, this is what we want for yield. This is the style of wine that we want. This is how we want our grapes to be grown, if that includes organics or biodynamics. And then that vineyard manager or that grape grower will farm that vineyard in accordance with the producer that's buying those grapes to make the wine. We can also choose different clones for their aromatic capacities, the structures that they'll have in the finished wine, and also for the color too. Certain clones have less color than others, even in the same grape variety. Pinot Noir is a really good example. A lot of vineyards are propagated from clonal selection, which is where we take one mother vine and we clone that vine over and over and over. A lot of clones that are really well known throughout the world, especially for Pinot Noir, Pommard, Wadenswil, and the Dijon clones, 114, 113, 114, 115, 667, 777. They always call it 777 if you ever see it. And these clones tend to be early ripening, which is really great for cooler climates like Burgundy, Dijon, where they were propagated and then spread throughout the world, especially places like California and Oregon. But these early ripening Dijon clones might not be great for warmer regions, right? In a warmer region, you want a clone that ripened a little bit slower and further into closer to the harvest season. The other way of propagating a vineyard, other than clonal selection, taking one single copy of a mother vine, and these vines do, even after you graft them, they do mutate within the vineyard, right? They do adapt to their surroundings, every single vine. So even when you use clonal selection, your vineyard still will have, each vine will have a little slightly different attributes over time. Another popular way to propagate your vineyard is through Massal selection. This is very popular in Burgundy, and this is used to really reinforce the positive traits and to eliminate negative traits through selection. Massal selection, essentially, vineyard managers, propagators, winemakers will go through the vineyard and they will actually select vines that have the traits that they want, and they'll take several of these vine cuttings from these vine with these positive traits, and they will graft those. So this is a way that you particularly see right now. We have a wine on our BTG list at Union Square by Julien Cruchendo, and he used Massal selection in Aubert de Valaine's vineyard of Aligote to plant his own vineyard. We see, as I mentioned before, we usually do not plant grape varieties or grapevines from seed, and all of those seeds are different. They won't necessarily have the same attributes of their parent vine. So usually we graft these selected vines onto a separate rootstock, and we typically use the American rootstock, so Vitis riparia, the one that we have here, but you also have Berlanderi rootstock as well that you might see, as well as some others. And you can actually choose these rootstocks for the region that you're grafting your vines in. Some are more resistant to water, so you might use Vitis riparia along like riverbanks or wetter regions. Some are more resistant to lime, like Berlandieri. We went to Texas Hill Country over the summer, and they have a lot of limestone. So a lot of the grafting is done onto the Vitis Berliandi rootstock, kind of help combat some of that lime that you see in the soil. A lot of decisions, right? Not as easy as we think. Once the vines are grafted and then planted, and you can graft your grapevine onto Vitis vinifera rootstock in the nursery. And then once that graft is holding, you can plant in your vineyard. You can also graft in the vineyard. And this is really common in places like maybe Spain, where you have really established rootstocks. but you want to grow different grape varieties. So you might actually graft in the vineyard onto the rootstock that you already have established. So once they are grafted and planted, if you're planting them, the vine doesn't produce a suitable harvest until its third year, but it begins to stabilize usually by the sixth year. After 20 years, yields begin to decline, and a lot of grapevines are uneconomical after 50 years. Now, we know this isn't true for all grapevines. Just like every vine had different traits that kind of, have a preference for. We mentioned like climate, weather, soil, how it's grown, right? They all have a different lifespan as well. Something like Sauvignon Blanc is usually replanted after, 20, 25 years. Cabernet Sauvignon, I'd say maybe like the Bordeaux grape varieties, they don't typically have as long of a lifespan as something like the more Mediterranean grape varieties, things like Syrah or Grenache, things like Zinfandel that come from Croatia. These are grapevines that have an intensely long life if they're well cared for in the vineyard. However, producers have to make that decision over time whether a vine is still economically viable. So as the yields begin to decline, we mentioned before, you tend to get more intense flavor, more complexity, more concentration, but you get less fruit. So you can make less wine and you have less wine to sell. So somewhere between the yield beginning to decline and the vine becoming uneconomical, the producer has to make that decision, right? Is it time to replant our vineyard so that we can have more fruit and more wine to sell, or do we want to raise the price of our wine because of the higher quality of the grape that we're getting, but the lower yields? All right, let's get into training and pruning. So essentially, there are really two types of training and pruning, and there are dozens of types of trellising, which will come up in a slide in a few moments. So we have head trained vines. The photo that you see on the right is not an example of a head trained vine. It is an example of a cordon trained vine. So a head trained vine doesn't have a permanent cordon, which are these two arms. So cordons are the arms. The trunk itself will just end kind of at the top in more of like a knob or a head. You can support this vine with a simple stake if you want to. You don't really see for head trained vines. I would say it's uncommon to see stakes, but you will see them for very old vines where you're trying to support the structure of that vine, or you might see it in regions that are heavily affected by wind. The best example is somewhere like the Northern Rhone, where a lot of the vines are head trained like this, and then they stake the vine. And this is because when the vine is being established, especially, the Mistral wind is so strong that it kind of starts to bend or blow over, not blow over so it falls out, but just the grapevine over time begins to grow like this. You see that if anybody's from a region that has a lot of wind, you see that with the trees, right? Where I grew up in Ellensburg, Washington, it's in a valley, it's really, really windy there. And so, I mean, a lot of the trees will grow in the main direction that the wind comes through. So they can be supported or not. So bush vines, we also call them, so bush vines is a common global term for head trained vines. They're known as albareo in places like Italy, and then known as invaso in Spain. These are really common places. Typically you see the griot training system. And then they're usually cane pruned. They can be spur pruned, which we'll talk about pruning here in one moment. This is a very difficult vine to mechanize. We're going to take a look at a few pictures. I just want to skip ahead because I want to make sure we have the right pictures, okay, that I could show you. But this is this head trained vine is a very difficult style or growth of vine to be able to mechanize. So this is another decision. So you might say, a lot of people do kind of fall on the side that this is the more quality way to grow grapes. It tends to be a way that you can optimize the lifespan of your grapevine for sure. It's much better for warmer, more Mediterranean climates where you essentially want to grow this sort of hat or hair, like cousin it almost, a vine that shades and protects the grapes that grow on the inside. So head trained vines are not very good for really cold or necessarily always like really wet regions, I guess I should say. What you have here is an example of a cordon train vine where you do have your trunk and you do have one or two permanent arms that extend from the trunk, and then your canes or your shoots grow from those arms that produce your fruit. So the head train vine, it would end here. Your canes or your shoots would essentially grow off it like almost like hair or like an umbrella. And then for your cordon train vine, you have one or two permanent arms. These don't tend to do as well in that's really interesting in really cold regions. You want to minimize how much actual kind of woody growth that you have. So the different reasons that we'll choose these different types of training and pruning methods. So one or two permanent canes called an arm or a cordon. They do grow really thick and gnarled over time. The fruit-bearing shoots emerge from the cordon every year. These are what are cut back and pruned during the winter. In the winter for a head train vine, they'll be cut or pruned back from here. They generally do require a trellising system. Head train vines typically do not have a trellising system, and they are spur pruned, meaning they're not, they're not being pruned from the head here. They're being pruned from a permanent cordon. So what are these two different styles of pruning? So spur versus cane. So cane or griot pruning is where you actually remove the cane from the head of the vine. So you see this a lot more often in these head train vines. You see this in a lot of cooler regions like Burgundy, Sonoma, Oregon. This really helps limit the lignified growth, so those arms or those cordons that you see, because those are more susceptible to things like frost, but especially a very deep winter freeze. So when you're pruning during the winter season after the harvest, you choose your pruning time really for when you depending on when you prune, it can really help inform when bud break will happen. So if you begin to prune a little bit later, bud break might happen later, and that's really advantageous for these cooler regions where you want to get out of the frost zone as much as you can before your grapevines begin to bud, right? That makes sense. And so you don't have as much of this lignified growth because this is really makes the vine much more sensitive, especially to winter freeze. So in that case, you would cane prune your vine where you actually cut off the kind of year's growth that has produced the fruit every year. And depending on where you decide to cut, informs where the growth will come from next year. So in grapevines, we usually will alternate what will be this year's growth that will produce fruit, and then what will be next year's growth, which will produce fruit. Spur pruning usually happens in a little bit of these warmer regions, California, Washington, Spain. There are a lot of different styles that we can see here, but the spurs are essentially the stub of a cane that produce 1 to 3 buds. And this is much easier to prune, much easier to mechanize. You can see all of these spurs that will become canes that will grow up here. And this is a style that you can typically see trained along a wire, and then the vegetative growth will usually be trained along a trellis as well. And this is much easier, one to mechanize, as I mentioned, but also to train people to work the vineyard. In head trained cane prune vine, really every individual vine usually you have to have very skilled labor that knows how to treat every vine, almost like managing people in a way. Every vine is different in terms of how it likes to be pruned, especially with head trained. It's much easier to prune and mechanize these spur pruned, cordon trained vines. What other types of training methods, right, do we see? So I guess maybe I should change this because these are more somewhat related to the training, but also to the trellising. So trellising of high vine would be something like pergola, where we have tall trunks that grow up. They lift the grapes high above the ground to increase the airflow. And, we try to increase sun exposure, but a lot of times in these pergola vines, they are kind of shaded. But this really helped to reduce the probability of fungal infection. So while high vines or pergola training is usually something that's employed for in a lot of places for either table grapes or in order to grow crops underneath. You do see it for high quality grape growing in cooler climate with high moisture. So, you know, a lot of places in Italy, you see it around like areas like Valpolicella, or where you might have a lot of lakes. You see it in kind of northern coastal Spain, where it's not warm and Mediterranean like the southern or the eastern coast, sort of the northwest Spain or the northeast of Spain before you move into Barcelona. On the Atlantic side, you see a lot of pergola train vine because it is a very humid and quite wet region. And so training your vine where the grapes hang down underneath the canopy really helps expose them to airflow and it helps the grapes and be resistant to rot during the growing season. This is a very labor intensive style of vine to work. Pergola train vines cannot be mechanized. They do require hand harvesting, and depending on the height of your vine, you might even need something like ladders or stools to be able to cut your grape during the harvest season. I have done a little bit of pergola harvesting before in Spain, and it's not easy. I mean, you're all types of hand harvesting for grapevines is hard. If you're harvesting the pergola train vine, you're standing on a ladder or you're standing on a box, and your hands are above your head the whole time, right? You're clipping your vines, putting them in the basket, clipping, putting them in your basket, clipping, putting them in your basket. So it's really a lot of work on your shoulders. But if you are hand harvesting these low train vines, you're constantly close to the ground, snipping. So the movement of your arms and your shoulders is smaller, but your back and your thighs are working really hard because you're constantly so low to the ground. And you'll be doing this for, depending on, you know, if you're just picking your own grapes in your own vineyard as a producer, you might be doing this for, you know, several days to a few weeks. But if you're a pick team, you're doing this for a month at a time, right? And being paid for it by the producer. So these lower vines have shorter trunks. They help reduce exposure to the sun. They moderate temperature variation. They are common in hotter regions because, as I mentioned, that the vines, the shoot kind of grow over and protect the grapes that are inside, almost like an umbrella. So this helps shade the grape. They help protect them from sunburn. You don't really have issues in a lot of these warmer, hotter regions with fungal pressure, disease, and moisture. So it's common to grow the grapes in this manner. In really dry regions, you're going to space your vines very far apart. This increases their ability to access the nutrients from the soil and decreases vine competition. So in moist or irrigated areas, if you have your vine too far apart, it will really increase production, but that reduces quality. So we don't want that. I mean, it's kind of like an oxymoron, right? It's like you want lower yield for better quality, but higher yield and lesser quality make growers more money. So this is why it's really important for winemakers and producers to work with their teams that grow their vines to find an economical solution for both, right? And then we have closely spaced vine. This will be in places like Bordeaux is a really common example where you have a lot of rainfall, and these closely spaced vines will help limit the vigor of the vine, helping to limit production and improve the quality. Different types of trellising methods that you might see. Single cordon, one arm, double cordon, two arms, single griot. We have a single trunk with just the cane extending from it. So these will never be removed, these cordons, right? The cordons will never be removed. They're a hard, woody, lignified part of the vine, just like the trunk. Single griot, double griot, the canes will be removed each year, depending on where you'll cut them, like either here or here, depending on what you want to be this year's and next year's growth, vegetative growth for the grapevine. But you can see that both of these will be pruned back. And these are already pruned, kind of, as you can see, right? The point of pruning is really to bring the vine back to its center. During pruning, nearly 90% of all of that year's growth of the vine is removed. So pruning is really an important process for the quality of the grapevine. You have things like Geneva double curtain and Scott Henry. This is used in regions or for grape varieties that are intensely vigorous again, this helps limit that vine vigor and can actually help improve the quality and the concentration of the grapes. So for Griot, usually you might be in regions where the soil is poor, the climate is cooler. And so you don't want too much growth because you don't want those grapes to have too much competition. They need to have just enough energy to ripen the way that you want them to. But in a climate that is warmer or drier or has a lot of nutrient dense soil or a lot of water, you want to use these bigger vine training systems that actually do create some competition between the grape clusters, right? And so this will help limit the yield as well. Pergola, we mentioned, usually the higher trunks grown up the sort of like you're in somewhere like Ria Spacious. Usually this is like a granite post, and then there's a pergola trellising system above, the grapes hang down below. The lyre system is really difficult to mechanize, easy to mechanize, hard to mechanize. These ones are okay to mechanize, can't mechanize. Lyre is also very hard to mechanize because it splits the canopy. You have your gobelets or head train vines, and then we haven't discussed the colora, the basket, the Stefani, but this is used in more Mediterranean climates. You see it a lot in places like Greece or Santorini, where there's a lot of sunshine and a lot of wind, and the vine itself is actually trained to grow around itself in a basket, and the grapes grow inside. So this really helps protect the skins of the grape from both wind and from sunburn. What fungal diseases might we see? I don't want to keep you too long, just looking at the clock, so we'll probably start moving a little bit quicker. So fungal diseases, the first two American fungal diseases, just like phylloxera, came to Europe from the US. We have powdery mildew. It affects the green parts of the plants. It covers the shoot, the leaves with kind of a dusty mildew growth. And what this does is it inhibits the development of the grapes and the ripening of the grapes as well. So first recorded in England in the 1840s, but it very quickly moved throughout Europe, and it's controlled by applications of sulfur and other fungicides. Downy mildew, another American fungal disease. This attacks the green portions of the vine, and the leaves drop off. If you don't have leaves, you can't photosynthesize and you cannot ripen your grapes. In response to this, the Bordeaux mixture was created. It is a spray of copper sulfate, water, and lime, developed in 1885. It is considered to be, the Bordeaux mixture is organic, but it does cause copper buildup in the vineyards. I think in the past, oftentimes the Bordeaux mixture, when we really started commercializing vineyard production after World War II, a lot of times things like the Bordeaux mixture were sprayed systemically and not actually in reaction to maybe a vintage that needed a little bit more attention because it was wetter or more humid. And so what we see today, I think, is a more integrated style of vineyard management, where rather than just spraying Bordeaux mixture or other fungicides, herbicides, etc., we really are reacting to the condition of the vintage itself. You type a dieback, we call this dead arm. You can see the dead arm Shiraz over here from D'Arenberg, coming from Australia. It's a great, great wine. Essentially, you type a dieback will not kill the vine, but it is a fungal disease that enters into pruning wounds. It's carried by rain, and it stunts the shoot growth, and then the canes might die. But this actually decreases the yield of the vine, and can, in places like D'Arenberg, think that this decrease in the yield is an increase in quality. So they actually name one of their signature wines for this, the Dead Arm Shiraz. So again, it's going to be a decision of the producer whether this increase in quality is worth it commercially versus the decrease in yields. Fungal diseases that you might see, ESCA or black measles, it tends to thrive in warmer climates. It can't be controlled or cured, but it does affect young vines. It can weaken the growth. It affects the berry development. It discolors the leaves. In older vines, it affects the wood and causes the trunk and the arm to soften and kind of rot from the inside out. It's kind of fun that, we've seen these diseases for millennia, right? The ancient Romans used to use Esca-infected tree trunks for firewood, had a more spongy interior, and they caught fire more quickly. We see both black rot and bunch rot. Black rot will originate as a black spot on the vine shoots. It can be controlled through fungicide sprays. You have bunch rot. Essentially, bunch rot can refers to the growth of botrytis, and botrytis can be both benevolent or malevolent. When it's benevolent, we call it noble rot, botrytis, right? It raisinates the grapes on the vine. It gives it these beautiful, like, kind of ginger, marmalade, saffron flavors. We make some of the world's best sweet wines out of grapes that are affected by noble rot or botrytis, the benevolent form of kind of this gray rot. But if it's not benevolent and it's malevolent, then it reduces crop yield. Both the benevolent and malevolent style do, but it also gives the wine moldy flavors. What is the main difference? I would say that the main difference is you have to have the right conditions for that rot to become the benevolent style, meaning kind of cold, misty mornings for it to grow in the first place, but then dry and sunny enough afternoon that it keeps it from forming into the malevolent form of the rot. We have bacterial diseases. Pierce disease is a really big issue, especially for California, that continues to move north. A producer named Randall Graham has a winery called Bonnie Doon, and he used to have a vineyard in the Santa Cruz Mountains that he lost to Pierce disease. It will ruin your vines. There's no cure. There's no chemical control. There's a lot of strict quarantines in other countries for this, but essentially the virus is transmitted by the leaf hopping insect, and it makes the vine incapable of producing chlorophyll. So the vine itself will die within 1 to 5 years. You have black knot or crown gall. You develop tumors or galls on the trunk, and this strangles the vine, killing the portions above it. You have bacterial blight. This will kill the younger grapevine shoots. Has dark brown streaks that develop in the spring, and eventually the shoots will wither and die. It's spread by rain and also by compromised pruning tools. So when you're pruning or even picking grapes during the harvest season, you're constantly cleaning those shears, right? Another, you might think of, like, we haven't talked a lot about phylloxera, but in some places like Oregon, where some vineyards are affected by phylloxera and others aren't, they will take really strict measures. A lot of producers make wine in Oregon from different AVAs, sub-AVAs, and from different vineyards. And if one is affected with phylloxera, you might see these producers who will actually, like, treat their shoes, treat their tires on their cars, treat all of their pruning and vineyard working materials when moving from one vineyard to another, so that they don't carry that phylloxera to a new vineyard. So it can be really important. Leaf roll virus and fan leaf degeneration, both viral diseases. Like I said, I don't want to keep you forever. So like, do we go through all of this, or do I let you just keep these slides for your own future reference? But as you can imagine, what really happens is we see a lot of reduced yield, delayed ripening. I oftentimes see this leaf roll virus. You might have noticed it in a vineyard. The leaves look really pretty, but they kind of like downturn. And this really affects the ripening of the grape, because you don't have the green leaf to photosynthesize sunlight, right? Fan leaf degeneration. This really affects the lifespan of the grapevine and also its winter durability, especially in cooler climates. So the last couple of things we'll talk about, some of the different certifications for agriculture or sustainable agriculture you might see. What are different types of sustainable agriculture? Organic, biodynamic, lutte raisonnée, regenerative farming. Lutte raisonnée is essentially means like the reasoned struggle. And this is for producers who may not be certified either organic or biodynamic. It's very expensive to certify your vineyard, and it's very labor intensive. It takes quite a few years to do that. So this is why a lot of producers might work with these practices, but they're not actually certified by one of these kind of governing organizations, which we'll talk about. So lutte raisonnée kind of means the raisin struggle. And this is also producers who sometimes in these more marginal climates, a lot of European climates, places like that, if you are certified organic, but there's a really horrific vintage of a lot of rain, a lot of rot, you're now a producer who has to make the decision between retaining your organic certification or maybe saving your vineyard. And I almost think of it in a way, it's like, as humans, like we may not want to take a lot of like excess medication, but that doesn't mean like if you don't have like a splitting migraine, you're not every now and then going to take some like Excedrin or something like that, right? So sometimes I kind of look at it the same way. I always think, you hear a lot of people that will say, oh, there's only one good way to grow grapes and make wine. And I just know that that's not true. And I don't think that from a perspective of a consumer, I don't think it's right for me to tell a grape grower or a winemaker how they have to grow their grapes or make their wine in the face of such adversity, right? I can definitely, with my dollar, vote for the styles of wine that I think are better for our environment and more make the type of wine that I want to drink, which I definitely do, because I do think that a lot of this sustainable agriculture grows better grapes, and better grapes make better wine. So I genuinely believe that's true, but I don't think it's up to me to go to producers and say, hey, if you decided that you have to spray, a chemical fungicide this year to save your vineyard, I'll never have your wine again. Maybe it's a strong opinion and other people might feel differently, and then you have regenerative farming, which is really a style of farming that takes the whole vineyard holistically. And it's also really important, too much to get into, but it's also about the concept of sequestering carbon and reintroducing a lot of microbial life into your soil. So this would include things like, again, not using systemic or chemical fertilizers, fungicides, herbicides, etc., things like that, but also making sure you're maintaining cover crops. Regenerative farming or agriculture does not employ tilling of the soil because you're really trying to sequester the carbon into the soils. And it's also about increasing, especially in other types of agriculture that aren't just grape, but really increasing the nutritional content of what you're growing through the soil. So essentially, it's a way of building like the environmental health of the world through your soil and what you're doing on your farm and in your vineyard if you're growing grapes. We have organic. There's two categories in the US: wine that is organic and wine made from organic grapes. Organic wines certified by the USDA have to be grown without synthetic fertilizers. All ingredients, including yeast, must be organic, and you can't add any sulfites. Although all wines have some sulfites that occur naturally, and these are permitted. Wines made with organically grown grapes do not have to have all of the ingredients used in the winemaking process to be organic. You must limit your sulfite to less than 100 parts per million. This is a lot. 100 parts per million is a lot. And they cannot carry the USDA's organic seal. I mean, sulfur is a natural preservative that in too high of amounts really affects both the color and the flavor of the wine, but without it, it also affects the color and flavor of the wine. Sulfur is just a stabilizer. We use it in almost, if you buy anything from the grocery store that comes sealed in a box, it has sulfites in it. It's a natural preservative. If you have dried fruit, it has sulfites in it. If you go somewhere and you look at, your farmer's market dried fruit that's not treated with sulfite, it's honestly not as pretty. The color is a little bit duller. It's oxidized, almost like, think about if you took an apple, you cut it in half and you sulfured one half, it would stay like you just cut it and you didn't sulfur the other half and it would brown like normal. So that's what sulfites do. They mostly protect, the wine. But we don't want to use too many. So it's a big conversation around it, maybe too much to get into. In the EU, we began to allow organic wine on labels. Previously, they were called made from organic grapes. The USDA certified organic wine can contain virtually no sulfite, and the EU counterpart can contain up to 100 parts per million. Again, this is a lot. I find that most, like today, now we have also some natural wine certifications in France. And I think usually like the sulfite part per million is around 30. So much lower than these rules. We also have a couple of different laws regarding organic wine made in Canada. Here are some of the bodies of certification that you might see. Demeter, the kind of the main biodynamic certification that you see. And then a lot of wine growing regions have their own own personal certification that you might see. So Certified California Sustainable Wine Growing, Lodi Rules is another really great example. Live, you might see, this is one that you see a lot in, there's also salmon safe in Washington State, meaning that you're growing your grapes or your vineyard in a way that doesn't impact the salmon watershed, which is really important. So there are a lot of different certifications for sustainable organic and biodynamic winemaking. What are biodynamics? It's a governing practice that goes back nearly a century. It was developed by this man, an Austrian, in 1924 named Rudolf Steiner. It does not change between countries. Organic does, biodynamic does not. It considers the farm as an entire living organism. It doesn't want a farm to be a monoculture. It really encourages the biodiversity of the farm. It also talks about making a farm self-sustainable. You produce your own animal manure, your own compost. You oftentimes time your what you do in the vineyard and in the winery with the lunar calendar. The more naturally occurring cycles like moon phases that will dictate when to harvest, when to taste wine, when to prune, when to rack, and all different types of things that you might consider in grape growing and winemaking. And then also the different days that tell you when the best day to harvest, prune, water, or leave your vineyard untouched. And this has a lot to do with the gravitational pull of the moon and how it affects the sap flow in the vines. I always tell people it's biodynamics. Never get your hair cut on a waning moon, right? Always get it cut on a waxing moon when things are growing. You want your hair to grow well? Always get it cut on a waxing moon. It has to do with sap flow. These are some different biodynamic preparations that you might see. Most people are familiar with the manure that's placed inside of the cow horn and buried during winter. This stimulates the microbial life in the soil and encourages root growth. You usually see it applied in the spring and in the fall. Really at the time that you do it is important as well. Also really important to see the silica, the powdered quartz that you spray onto your vines, or you can place in a cow horn and bury it during the summer as well. Usually applied in late spring, early summer. You always apply it at sunrise. I've never seen it applied any other time. Horsetail plant can fight against fungal infection. Yellow flower, chamomile, stinging nettles, oak bark, dandelion flowers, valerian flowers. These are all natural tinctures, compost preparation that you can use within your vineyard to work with your vineyard in a more natural and holistic way. You can see preparing the compost, the manure inside of the cow horn, burying those cow horn, encouraging that microbial growth in the soil, along with the root growth of the plant. This is also a biodynamic calendar that you see where you might find the different days that would be best in this year. This one, I don't know what year this one was for, but just the days that you can see how the biodynamic calendar just tells you based on the phases of the moon, what days would be best for the different preparations or different ways to work both in the vineyard and within the winery as well. So the last thing, this is Masanobu Fukuoka. So Ryan really put a lot of these slides together. He did this class previously, and I left this one in because I really liked that he showed this. But this is a gentleman from Japan who had this sort of process of do nothing. And the idea of that is, you know, if you were in a forest and you left the forest for 20 years and you came back, it's still a forest. So the concept behind his style of viticulture, this kind of do nothing style of viticulture, is letting the vine correct itself, like letting nature correct itself. And this will happen. We can, as you can see, we have a lot of opportunities at our disposal to craft the style of vineyard and wine that we want to make as we're growing and treating and pruning and trellising these grapevines. But most importantly, I think, like looking at your climate, the type of grapevine that you're growing, this has a lot to do with how you trellis it too. Some grape varieties like Sauvignon Blanc, just naturally on their own, they grow straight up. So vertical shoot positioning off of a cordon is really good for the vegetative growth of Sauvignon Blanc. Something like Syrah, it grows, it kind of like droops. That's the way it grows. It likes to grow downward. That's why you see a lot more Syrah grown as a head trained or bush vine, right? So this is kind of the idea of this gentleman where there's quite a few followers, even here in the United States, of his style of winemaking. The first one that comes to mind is Hank Beckenmeyer from La Clarine Farm, located in the Sierra Foothills in California. But this kind of idea of letting the grapevine, the vineyard, and nature regulate itself over time without too much intervention. Thank you. I know we covered a lot. I hope that we were able to really give you some insight into the different decisions that you would make in viticulture, growing the grapes in accordance with the style of wine that the producer is looking to make. I know it's a lot to cover, and there's a lot of really complex nuances and topics to talk about, but I really hope this gave you kind of a great foundation to understand pruning, trellising, the life cycle of the vine, and harvesting your grapes. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you soon. Have a nice day.